Hello, it's me, Yvonne, your local non-binary witch, and today I'd like to talk about moon water. Now, until very recently, like within the last year in fact, I had not heard of the concept of moon water. I remember seeing things about putting crystals in water to cleanse them and possibly leaving them in moonlight to help with that cleansing, or leaving them in sunlight to help with that cleansing. But I hadn't specifically heard of moon water, and that got me to thinking, what what is moon water and where did it come from? So I turned to Google, and if you Google for moon water, you can find a lot of articles about how to make it and what you can use it for, but very little about its history. So one idea that occurred to me was the idea that I'd never heard of moon water because when I lived in the UK, I could go to Glastonbury and go to the Chalice Well and get some water from the Chalice Well or from the White Spring, which is just up the road. And I could go to any number of holy wells living in the UK and get water from them, and that would be inherently sacred water because it's been filtered up through the earth and it's really pure. So I thought, well, maybe it's because there's no tradition of sacred springs in North America. So I thought, well, is it because the geology is different? I mean, obviously the history is very different because the reason that there are lots of holy wells or sacred springs in Britain is because they are a hangover from pagan practice. So clearly indigenous people in North America hold water very sacred, and like for instance, I'm in the land of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee and the Atawandaraon, and they have a strong relationship with the water, and every year the local Anishinaabe people hold a water walk to the sources of the Grand River and to honour the water and to emphasise the sacredness of it. And there are also many people who are water protectors who are resisting pipelines. So clearly water is very sacred in North America, but also because most settlers completely disrespected the indigenous lifeways, the knowledge of the sacredness of the water and the particular associations of the sacred springs wouldn't have carried over from the indigenous population to the settler population. So there's a different bit of history right there. So then I thought, well, maybe whoever invented moon water, it's because they didn't have any sacred springs in their vicinity. So maybe they thought, well, I'll just get some water and expose it to the moon and then that will make it sacred, which it clearly does. So I asked around and I found out that Louisiana was one of the places that moon water came from. And I also did a bit of Googling and I found out that the Ozarks, the Ozark Mountains, was another place where moon water came from. So I found a map of sacred springs in North America, or Turtle Island, and I zoomed in to the map, and lo and behold, Louisiana has very few sacred springs, and the same applies to the Ozarks. Probably for very different reasons. I would imagine that the water table is very high in Louisiana, and in the Ozarks perhaps the geology doesn't allow for it. But either way, the folkloric tradition of moon water seems to originate from these two places, and that's borne out by the geology and the terrain. So that would explain that. So I just thought that was really interesting, because traditions don't spring from nowhere. They emerge out of a practical need, and they, you know, they have a particular form for historical reasons, and they have a particular function, like either in magic or tradition or folklore or whatever, and that function is what enables them to be transmitted through to the next generation. Hope I haven't mangled the anthropology theory too much there. So when you find a custom or something that's mentioned online, whether it's moon water or some other thing, you should always consider, where does this tradition come from? Does it fit in with my existing practice? And is there something that I could be doing that's more appropriate to the locale that I'm in, or the terrain that I'm in? So if you live in Britain, unless you live in an area with no sacred springs or holy wells, then you probably don't need to make moon water unless you're going to go to your sacred spring and leave the water you've collected in the moonlight to absorb the moonlight. So I think, and also there's always the question of cultural appropriation, because, you know, the tradition that, like, the moon water may have a specific meaning and function in the traditions that it came from, and therefore we might be using it wrongly or differently or whatever. Similarly, there are various herbs like white sage and Palo Santo, which are becoming very rare and expensive and inaccessible to the people whose traditions they actually come from. So we should stop using those things because we are by using them and creating a demand for them, we're actually denying access to them for the people who actually first discovered and used them in their traditions. So we should be aware of that. I mean, obviously, moon water is a fairly widespread commodity. So if you make moon water, you're not taking it away from anyone else. So that's all good. Moonlight is also free, which is nice. But I do think that we should consider where we get these ideas from and whether they actually fit in our practice or not. So, you know, have a think about how that fits in your practice and whether there's some tradition that's more local to you that you could use. Another example is not saying smudging, because when I was a young witch, oh yes, it wasn't called smudging, it was called censing the circle, CENSING. Or you can just say waving incense around if you want, but smudging refers to a very specific indigenous practice, and it's not up for grabs by other traditions, so we should call it something else. And smudging is different from the practice of censing. It's done differently and it's done with different materials, so two very different things. And in Scotland, apparently, they call it saining, which SAINING, which means the same as blessing in effect. So I thought that was interesting. So yes, when we take on a new tradition or we find a new practice, we do need to investigate the sources of that. So there you go. So have fun out there, take care, and blessed be.